Koinach! Good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then loving life will guide you. I know that life outside is so hard. There's a lot of things that can tear you apart. Sometimes feel lonely, but remember you're not the one and only. There's always someone there to help you, a helping hand to pull you through. There's only one thing you should do: take my hand and join the loving life crew. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then a loving life.
Koinach! Good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Good to see a good crowd here already. Fantastic. Well over 100 people. Now, tonight we have a very, very special guest, Mark Oppenheimer. Mark has a special interest in constitutional law, municipal law, and commercial disputes. He works closely with AfriForum. He has published articles about property rights, freedom of expression, and affirmative action. We're going to be covering a whole range of subjects tonight, which I think you'll find very interesting. And please remember to use the side chat, put your questions in there. The moderators will copy them and paste them later when we're ready to take those questions. Mark has been called upon for legal commentary on both TV and radio. Okay, let's watch a short video by Mark on free speech and hate speech. This is a very, very relevant subject right now in South Africa. Here we go.
We should be aware that hatred is not a natural and spontaneous sentiment. It is usually the outcome of propaganda and incitement to hatred, hostility and violence carried out at several levels, including social, political and media. We're going to have this tension between free speech and hate speech, and I'm going to try and tease out what is meant by those two different terms. So the starting point is going to be our South African Constitution. So Section 16 of the Constitution says, everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which includes freedom of the press and other media, freedom to receive or impart information or ideas, freedom of artistic creativity, and academic freedom and scientific research. So let's think a little bit about these. As members of the press, you will appreciate how important it is to be able to express the ideas that you want in a newspaper. Our South African courts say that the press has a unique role to play in our democracy. If we think about this freedom to exchange ideas, it's not only that the person speaking has this right, it's that the audience has a right. So when we think about someone like Fleming Rose, who is deplatformed at a university like University of Cape Town, it is not just that his right has been denied, it is that all those students that want to listen to him, their rights have been infringed. And if we think about freedom of artistic creativity, we're honored to have the cartoonist Jerome with us today. It's important that artists like him and like Sapiro are given this freedom to express themselves. That creativity often makes people uncomfortable, but we entrench that right. And of course, in the realm of academia, it's important that people are able to research what they want, that we don't have this constraint on knowledge. Now, we know that we have this constitutional right, but I think it's important that we talk about the values that underlie that right. So the free dissemination of ideas allows for intellectual, artistic, and scientific progress while provoking discussion and aiding the search for truth. By stifling ideas that are different from our own, we lose the opportunity to challenge, reconsider, and perhaps reaffirm our own views. Freedom of expression is the cornerstone of a democratic state. It exposes people to differing viewpoints so they can make informed decisions about their political and private lives. So if you think about this, if you're a voter in a democracy, how can you exercise your vote properly if you're unaware of what your options really are? It's important that you're given this space to debate, to engage, that you can say what you think and possibly change your mind. We should be aware.
Okay, that gives you a bit of an insight into one of the subjects we're going to be covering tonight. Now, Ronald Reagan said, and this is really summing up the whole aspect of freedom of speech, he said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Okay, let me get Mark online and we'll start the conversation. Here we go, guys. Hi, Mark.
Okay.
I'm just waiting for your camera to come on. Oh, there you are. Fantastic. Perfect. Now, Mark, I just want to read to you a comment that was made on my channel under one of the videos just a few days ago. And I think for many people it actually sums up what is going on in South Africa. And it's to do with that elderly lady who was walking her little dog along that street. There was no one around, and all these police came and surrounded her. I'm sure you've seen the photo, and it just seemed extraordinary. And John wrote, in response to this, the comments, that she was out in public wearing an offensive skin color. That was her real crime. I thought that kind of sums up how a lot of people think in South Africa today. Now, before we get into discussing a whole range of issues like free speech and so on, what I'd like to do is find out a bit about yourself, your background, where you grew up, just so our audience have a little bit of your story.
Sure, with pleasure. So I'm based in Johannesburg. I live in Sandton. I went to the University of Cape Town, so I studied philosophy and law there. And my practice is in constitutional law. So I do a lot of work on free speech and on property rights. I did a submission to Parliament on expropriation or compensation, which I did in person, and I've done a couple of written ones as well. And I've been involved in a lot of cases around this question as to what is the value of free speech and where are its limits at the end of genuine hate speech.
Right. Okay. Now, we're talking about hate speech and hateful speech and the differences between the two. Would you like to explain to people what is hate speech and what defines it as a separate form of speech to hateful speech?
Well, that's an excellent distinction to draw. So I'll give you a little bit of an idea of how to understand the question. So the starting point must be our Constitution. And what our Constitution does in South Africa in Section 16 is grant everyone a very broad free speech right. So everyone has the right to freedom of expression, and it specifically lists artistic creativity, freedom of the press, academic inquiry, and then it says it's limited in 3 cases. So the first is propaganda for war. The second is the incitement of imminent violence. And the third is the hate speech clause, really, the advocacy of hatred on one of 4 grounds: race, gender, ethnicity, and religion, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. So let me try and unpack that a little bit. If we start at the first ground, this idea of propaganda for war, we can think of an immense amount of harm, involved in a war. The second ground is this incitement of imminent violence. So first of all, violence being, destruction of property or loss of life, people being physically assaulted.
Right.
That's what we mean by violence, as opposed to the kinds of ways that, university students will often refer to your presence as a violence, or, you uttering that word is a violence. That's not what's meant by the Constitution.
Right.
And then also this idea of there must be an incitement, which means a call to action. So the idea is that you're calling upon people to perform the act of violence. And when? Imminently, now. So you can imagine the kind of classic case that's given by John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, is imagine that you're standing in front of an angry mob and you say to them, the factory owner has been exploiting you and you need to rise up and you need to get him. And they're all holding their pitchforks and their lantern and they're right outside the factory. It's a very good chance that they're going to set the factory alight and they're going to kill the factory owner. Now, Mill says you could say the exact same thing in a different forum, like a newspaper. When all the factory workers are dispersed, they're sitting around eating their bacon and eggs in the morning, reading the paper, and they hear that. There's no imminent call to action. So with hate speech, what we do is we remove the imminency requirement and we water down violence to harm. But there must still be a call to action. And also we limited it to those 4 groups. So race, gender, ethnicity, and religion. And the idea is that those groups have a history of being targeted. And that's why they're accorded a special protection. Okay, so that's our constitutional framework.
Right.
Now, I'm sure you are going to feel a little puzzled because that's not what we've seen in action, right?
Exactly.
We've seen people convicted for hate speech that haven't done any of that.
Mm.
All right, so why? Well, there's a couple of different laws that regulate speech in South Africa. So the one is the Equality Act. And the Equality Act has its own hate speech clause. And what it says is that hate speech is the act of communicating, propagating, advocating words which are hurtful, semicolon, harmful or incite harm, semicolon, propagate or promote hatred. Now, one of the early questions that courts had to deal with was, well, you've got this list, but do we have to read the list together, conjunctively, or as or phrases? And we got different views. So for Penny Sparrow, probably the most sort of famous case of someone being found liable for hate speech in South Africa in 2016. There what the magistrates court did was they said what she said was hurtful. Now you may remember what you did was compare black beachgoers to monkeys. Now an undoubtedly racist comparison. But at no point did she ever call upon people to do anything about people on the beach. So the magistrate said, well, what she said was hurtful on the grounds of race, and that is sufficient for hate speech. I then appeared in a matter against a guy called Valapi Kamalo on behalf of the Human Rights Commission.
Right.
And Valapi Kamalo had responded to Penny Sparrow, and he responded in very strong words. He said, we need to do to white people what Hitler did to the Jews. They should be burnt alive, hacked to death, and their children turned into garden fertilizer. Now, what was interesting was that at the time, Penny Sparrow was all over the news. It's a conversation that sort of was had for a very long time, and almost no one had heard of Valapi Kamalo. Now, Valapi Kamalo worked in government, a member of the ANC, and for a long time nothing happened. It's part of that is that there were various procedural challenges that took a long time to find him, to serve on him, but we eventually did run litigation. And the strategy that we took as the legal team was to say, look, this is a genuine case of hate speech. It meets all the constitutional criteria. It's advocating hatred on the grounds of race, and there is this call to action, quite a strong call for violent action to be taken. So we're satisfied that it meets the constitutional threshold test. But we also need to protect free speech rights. And so what we called for was the court to interpret the Equality Act conjunctively, so that all of those requirements would be met as and requirements. And that is what the court did ultimately. Now, the cases have sort of moved on since then to some extent. There's a matter against John Kwalani. Some of you remember John as a quite famous anti-apartheid journalist. The piece that he was quite infamous for was a piece with the headline, "Call Me Names, but Gay is Not Okay." And it was accompanied by a cartoon of a man marrying a goat with a priest saying, "I now pronounce you man and goat." And in that article, he raised some questions about gay marriage. Now, for the record, John didn't produce the cartoon, he didn't produce the headline, but those two things were sort of very strong reasons why he was held before an equality court. Now, in my personal view, I support gay marriage. I think it's a great thing that South Africa was the 5th country in the world to allow gay marriage, and I believe in freedom generally, and I think we should extend it generally. But I also think people should have the freedom to express different views on the subject matter. There's been a long-standing consensus that marriage was between one man and one woman, and that view has shifted over time, but for people who hold the old view, they should be free to express it. John was held liable for hate speech, and in 2008, and then the matter went on appeal last year. And I appeared in that appeal, and the Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa found that the legislation which had namely the Equality Act was unconstitutional. That trying to interpret in this conjunctive manner didn't work, and it therefore only prohibited hurtful speech, which is not the same as hate speech. That question is now going before our Constitutional Court, and at the moment the hearing is set for the 7th of May. So we will then have some finality as to this question as to what is hate speech and what is free speech.
Right. Now, I need to raise an issue which is so important and related to that. We have the case of Vicky Momberg and her outbreak when she was emotionally distressed after being mugged, and she used the K word a number of times. And there are two issues I want to raise about this. The first one, and probably the most important one, is that she was convicted to 3 years jail, and she had to spend 2 of those behind bars, according to the judge. Now, I want to get back to the selection of judges and the issues relating to judges in South Africa later in this program. But when you compare the action that was taken against Vicky Momberg to the lack of action taken against people like Lindsay Marsdorp of the BLF, and Dili Nixitama of the BLF, and Julius Malema of the EFF, isn't there a huge inequality here in the way the South African Human Rights Commission operates, and also the judicial system, when it comes to Vicky being a white person and these others being politicians? I mean, there seems to be a complete breakdown there. What are your views on that?
Yes, I think we must be vigilant about any kind of double standard. So, our Constitution says that we are all equal before the law, regardless of our race. And so, if you have a sense in which some people are being held accountable and others aren't, and different standards are being applied, that is a serious concern. Now, just to give you an idea, I'm an advocate, so I'm independent. I work for anyone who asks me to. We have a rule called the cab rank rule, which in other words, if someone asks me to appear for them, I cannot say no because I don't like their politics or I don't like who they are. The idea is everyone must get a fair shake of justice. So I have acted for the Human Rights Commission, and I'm currently involved in litigation where they're on the other side. Now, with regards to how the Human Rights Commission has dealt with some of these matters, there is a concern that they haven't applied the same standards. So, and this is sort of made explicit with regards to a statement made by Julius Malema from the EFF. So, Mr. Malema had stated that we should invade white-owned land, and that he wasn't calling for the slaughtering of white people, at least for now. And a complaint was made to the Human Rights Commission, and the Human Rights Commission found that it did not constitute hate speech. And part of their reasoning when they held a press conference was to say that different rules apply for different races. That because Julius Malema is black, and because the people being targeted are white, that the rules should be different. Now, that matter is currently on review. I appear in that matter, and we are reviewing the decision taken by the Human Rights Commission. I'll also say this, which is that my bar rules prohibit me from prognosticating upon the outcome of certain matters. I can speak in general terms about the matters that I'm involved in, so I can give you an idea of the facts, which are publicly available facts. But yeah, so I think you're right to highlight that concern. I'll say a couple of things about Vicky Momberg as well. So there were two cases against her. The first was a hate speech case. Now, the hate speech legislation doesn't actually have any criminal penalties. It has civil sanctions, so you can be required to pay a fine. But criminal injuria, which is a common law remedy, has these criminal sanctions. And so Momberg was the first person to be given a criminal sentence for speech for criminal injuria. Now, we know that during the 80s, sort of at the height of apartheid, use of the K word had been found to be criminal injuria even then by our courts. John Didcott had found that. So the idea is criminal injuria is when you severely impact the dignity of someone else, either through your physical actions or through your words. But the prior sanctions were apologies or fines. Now, I think the difficulty with someone like Vicky Momberg is that she did herself no favors in the litigation. So she went through, I think, 6 different lawyers. She probably has some kind of bipolar disorder, and so it was not a sympathetic case. But the problem with that is that we've now set this very dangerous precedent in our law, which is that we can jail people for their words, even when they're not calling on others to perform acts of violence.
Right. Okay. Now, you raised the point about the racial issue, and there's a very interesting statement that was made by Kwabi to the Sunday Times when the Sunday Times asked him, with the fees must fall, whether that organization hadn't become anti-white racism. Now, Kwabi retorted that there can never be racism against white people. Now, the foundation of racism is that one group's thinking that they are superior to another. Now, doesn't Kwabi's comment suggest, in effect, that he thinks he is inferior to the whites and therefore he cannot be racist?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, right? Is what is racism? And the traditional answers have been, as you say, the one is a belief statement about one's presumed inferiority or superiority, and the other one is about the way that you treat people.
Right.
Now, that's always been cashed out neutrally. In other words, it's entirely possible for a person who comes from India to think that they are superior to someone who comes from Tibet or China. That we find that across the world, people have these beliefs about them being superior or inferior, and that's not. And you can have people who are neither white nor black, right?
Right.
Sort of more fashionable definition that's been floating around nowadays is, well, no, there's this sort of privilege Olympics, in which what the first question we ask is, well, how powerful is the particular group? And if you rank it, and I often think the way that people do this ranking is really quite obnoxious, because what they do implicitly is they think that the best people are the straight white men at the top of the pyramid, and the worst people are the black disabled lesbians. And then what they do is they want to flip the pyramid and say, well, then we accord different rights based on the pyramid status so that we can have some kind of redressed equality. That's a very bizarre way of thinking, to my mind. Instead of thinking, we're all human beings, we all have the capacity for love and kindness, and we all have the capacity for hate and discrimination. There's actually, I don't know if you've ever watched the series Orange is the New Black about a woman's prison. It's based on a book. And there's a sequence where a group of black prisoners are sitting around a table. One of them says, black people can't be racist. The other person says, this is America. We can be whatever we want. The question is whether we have the ability to do anything about our racism. And so I think that's a fair question. In other words, do you have the power to affect your racist beliefs?
Right.
And that's going to be a contextual question. So if you're a minority group, you may find it very hard to sort of express your racism in a society, that you don't have access to levels of power. If you're a majority group, you might find it very, very easy. So that question can't be answered in the abstract. It must be answered in the particular country in which you live.
Right. Now, you mentioned about the media, and one of the things that I personally have experienced, and it really makes you feel very vulnerable, if I can put it that way, is when the media label you. In other words, they attach a demeaning word to you as if it's truth when it's not. And one of those situations was with, getting back to Vicky Momberg, every single article I've seen in most newspapers in South Africa where her name is raised, before you see Vicky Momberg, it says racist Vicky Momberg. So that's a labeling that person based on that ruling that was made in a court. It
Often described as convicted racist.
No,
in other words, which implies that there is a crime of being a racist. There is no such crime. In other words, we must differentiate between it being immoral to be a certain way and it being a crime. So we used to convict adulterers. It was a crime. We might think it's immoral to commit the act of adultery, but it is definitely not illegal. You could say convicted for the crime of criminuria. That might be accurate, but there's something, as you say, about convicted racist that there's a certain propagandish feel about it.
Yeah, well, it's basic labeling, and I'd like to turn to the media, because really I have a real gripe with the mainstream media, and I'm not just talking about South Africa, I'm talking all over the world. It's clear they have their own narrative, and they only publish what fits their narrative. And just to give you a bit of background to this, Solidarity has produced, let me just do something here, give me a second. Okay, we'll just share the screen. Okay. Sorry. Solidarity has produced an extensive report outlining selective reporting on racism in South Africa. The report shows that racist statements made by whites received 1,286 media mentions on average, while racist statements by blacks received only 66 mentions on average. This demonstrates that there is an overwhelming tendency in the press to ignore anti-white racism. And James Byberg notes that, by contrast, every physical or verbal assault or insult or act of racial impertinence directed by a white person against black people receives huge coverage and sets off wave after wave of condemnation. Demands are then made for the severest of punishments, no matter how disproportionate to the actual offence, and for even more stringent measures to stamp out the scourge of anti-black racism once and for all. When media loses its sense of balance and proportion in this way, and becomes fixated on the wrongdoings of individuals from a particular minority, it is turned away from journalism towards racial propaganda. Now, if you look what's happening, for example, on the farms in South Africa, these absolutely abhorrent farm attacks where people are tortured, children are put through, I just can't even go there, it just makes my blood boil. But the media totally ignores this. But then you have the example of the coffin case with those two white guys who were, thrown behind bars for 14 years or something like that, when all they did was try and make the guy scared, to try to intimidate him. There's the actual media coverage. There is something incredibly wrong with that. What are your views on this?
Yeah, I think it is a big concern, and I think that sort of the press has not covered themselves in glory on this basis. Now, as I said, they've tried to dodge the bullet by changing the framework to say, well, no, we must apply a double standard because that's what justice requires. We need to redress the wrongs of the past by having different rules for different races. And there's something very obnoxious about that. Section 1 of our Constitution says that South Africa is a nation founded on the value of non-racialism. Now, non-racialism is the idea that, we don't judge people by the color of their skin, but rather by the content of their character, that we reject having different rules for different races. We tried that in South Africa for a long time. It didn't work. It was a terrible system, an evil system, and we should not be doing that again. So, yeah, there's a big concern about that. I mean, on farm murders, one of the things that's the book to read on farm murders is by Ernst Rutt's Kill the Boer, and Ernst has put in an enormous amount of effort into sort of diagnosing the problem from a number of different lenses. The one is to sort of go and look at the hard data, over time, and they've taken SAP's data and they've taken their own data as well, and have a sense of the trends. And one of the things that's sort of done is people will say, well, only so many people died in a particular year, compare that to how many people die, in this other area. But the right way to look at the data is to kind of look at it on a per capita basis. So if you realize how few commercial farmers there are in South Africa, I think there's about 30,000.
There used to be 70.
And you look at how many people are killed.
Yeah.
And here's another interesting thing. When we look at murder rates generally, when you think of people dying, we think of it in terms of intruder attacks. So we think, a bad guy breaks into your house and ties you up and kills you. It's actually a small portion of deaths. So a lot of deaths, I think 80% of them are social fabric crimes. So they're by people that you know. So it's spouses killing each other, it's people in bar fights. Very few people are actually killed by intruders, except for farmers who are all killed by intruders.
Right.
So when you compare rates, what you have to do is compare, let's say, a person who lives at home who is killed by an intruder versus a farmer. And the farmer is killed at something like 10 to 1. It's a dramatically big difference on a per capita basis. So it is a high-risk thing. And the action that's called for is actually very moderate. It's to say, well, there's something unique about farmers. Firstly, there's a very small number of them, and they perform a vital function in South Africa, now more than ever, which is that they secure our food. And the other one is that they have very big areas of land, which are not easily secured in the same way that a private home is secured. So the call is to sort of have special measures to protect farmers, in the same way that we have special measures to address other kinds of crimes, like rhino poaching or copper cable theft. There's specialized units to deal with that. And I think that's a very reasonable way of dealing with this specific problem.
Right. Okay. Now, there are a couple of points I just want to pick up on there. Now, we've just talked about food security. I'm seeing more and more reports right now in South Africa of the poor people in the townships are actually in a position where they're starving. They're basically starving, and people who now go in there with food parcels have been literally attacked, and their vehicles being raided, and the food parcels being stolen because people are that desperate. Shops are being looted. This is all under the ANC's watch. Now, what are your thoughts about how this situation is going to evolve? Because clearly, this is a very, very dangerous position we're in right now in South Africa.
Yes. So I suppose, look, to answer that question, we've got to talk about the lockdown and COVID and methods of addressing COVID. In other words, the process of looting is a unique situation that's happening now. So we've got to zoom out a little bit. And I think we've got to think about this in a couple of ways. So the one is, the world is dealing with a pandemic. And different governments around the world are taking measures to try and save lives. And everyone is aware of this sort of phrase, flatten the curve. Okay. Now, when we talk about flatten the curve, we've got to think, well, what is the purpose of flattening the curve? Purpose is if you can slow down people's contact with each other, you may wind up with a very similar number of people getting infected with COVID at the end of the outbreak, but you don't have this big spike. The problem with the big spike is that you can overwhelm a hospital, and people who need a hospital bed and who would recover if they got a hospital bed won't get one and they will die. So you'll have all these deaths that are sort of preventable deaths, and so that's the purpose of why you would have a lockdown. Now, South Africa acted very swiftly. We moved to lockdown very soon after our cases started to climb. We found that.
Can I just interrupt there for a second? We're talking about the lockdown. One of the key aspects of a lockdown is social distancing. Now, at the start of this live stream, I referred to that old woman with her dog and how she was apprehended. She was by herself. There weren't people around her. There's so much video footage in the townships, in the taxis, where there's complete disregard to social distancing, and nothing is being done about it. Now, well, I know they're putting the police out there and the army out there, but clearly as soon as they go on, everybody's milling around again. So it completely destroys the whole concept of a lockdown and social distancing, which is probably the most important part of actually stopping COVID from spreading. So the question is, why have a lockdown? Because it's completely compromised by what's going on around South Africa in the townships. I mean, you're just destroying the economy, basically.
Yes. So again, we've got to think, what is the purpose of the lockdown? As I say, the purpose of it is really to try and buy time. So that's for a couple of things. The one is so you can capitalize your medical resources, so you can build field hospitals, which they've done in the UK and in the Western Cape. They've turned the convention centre into a field hospital, so that's one reason why you have a lockdown.
Right.
And the other one is to buy time, let's say, for treatments to improve. And the other one, which is a very long amount of time to buy, is that you have a vaccine. Now, the vaccine is going to take 18 months. Now, so those are lockdown measures. You must then accept the costs involved in a lockdown, which are economic and social. So if you lock down an economy for a certain period of time, it's not like you can put it in hibernation. You don't dry freeze an economy. It rots, and it cannot be resuscitated. If you close down a restaurant, for example, it might be that it can survive being closed down for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, but once it gets to 2 months, it just goes bankrupt, and that's it. Those jobs are lost, the business is dead.
Right.
So those are the economic costs. But the economic costs and the health costs are not straight-off trade-offs, they're interrelated. So if a lot of people die, that will have economic consequences. There will be lots of breadwinners and consumers who will die, and that'll have an economic cost. Similarly, if you destroy the economy, that'll have health costs. People will not be able to feed themselves.
Right.
That there will be not only health consequences, but there will be social consequences. You will have, rioting and public disorder. You will have confrontations with the police and the army, like we've already seen. So, it's not quite the case that nothing is being done in the townships. Often what is being done is very excessive. The police have killed people in their custody for breaking lockdowns. And I would bet that they've been often very brutal in township areas. So it's not a simple matter of sort of looking at people in taxis and looking at people in suburbs and sort of getting the difference. I mean, I think we've got to look at the bigger picture and work out what's going on, and what's going on is going to have all these other additional consequences, the consequences of the consequences. But as you point out, we must have a rational reason for why we restrict people's rights. So again, the thing we spoke about in the beginning was our constitution, and this is our kind of Grundnorm in South Africa, and our constitution has not been suspended. So we have not declared a state of emergency. All the rights in the Bill of Rights are there. Now, what they are being is limited by regulations that have been put in place. So in order for them to be limited, they have to meet the limitations test in the Constitution, Section 36, which says that any right in the Bill of Rights can be limited provided that it is justifiable in an open and democratic country. You need to follow a rationality test. So you have to see, well, how important is the right that we're limiting? Is the limitation rationally connected to the purpose? And are there less restrictive means? So, for example, on the question of freedom of movement, we have heavily restricted this right. I mean, people are not free to leave their homes and go to parks and, go to bars and, do the kinds of things that they were doing in a pre-COVID world. So we've limited the right dramatically. But we also know that many countries around the world have limited the right dramatically. And a lot of these countries are open and democratic countries. So we have some indication about, where we're at on that front. But there may be other limitations that are completely irrational. So one of the ones that's worth thinking about is we've drawn this distinction between essential goods and non-essential goods. Now, the thing is, economies are interrelated. So if we think about essential goods, so food and medicine,
right?
How do we get those things? Well, we require logistics companies. We require marketing companies. There's all these sub-levels below the essential that make the essential happen, and below that tier, there's more and more and more. So instead of thinking about as essential and non-essential, what we might rather want to do is think about: are there certain businesses that, if they were to operate, would pose a huge health risk? In other words, they could not operate safely given the virus. And are there other industries which might be selling things that we think of as non-essential, but are perfectly capable of operating in a way that is safe? And that might be a much more rational distinction.
Right. Now, I still get back to the point that the whole idea of a lockdown is for people to keep a social distance. But that is impossible in a lot of the homes in townships. They've got 4 or 5 families living in a small area. It's impossible for them to keep a social distance. And when they do go out, I mean, there's so many videos of people who are they're just acting as if it's another day. They're not concerned about the threat of getting COVID-19. And the taxis, I can't understand. I understand that they're critical to get people around, but that's a petri dish for the coronavirus, because you've got a number of people sitting in a confined space for a period of time. One of those people has COVID-19 and everybody has it. It seems to fly in the face of a lockdown, the social distancing problem.
Yes, so if you look at the regulations around public transport, I mean, this is something that government, I think, is trying to grapple with, which is, a lot of those essential workers don't have their own cars. So if you're a nurse who doesn't have your own car, you require the use of public transport and, often the use of a taxi. And so the original rule was taxis could only go up to 50% of their capacity, that you couldn't pack people in. And then I think there's a rule which is to try and get people to wear masks when they're in taxis, that they have to sanitize the insides of the taxis. So I think there are mitigation things. Look, here's the other thing as well is, if you look at those graphs around the effect of social distancing to stop the spread, because it's exponential growth, it's accepted in those projections that you cannot get, perfect containment, but you can sort of try and, you can slow it down. So you are going to have these problems in the way, but that may, in other words, it's not a choice between fully on or fully off. Some sort of in between might give you enough of a spread that you can live with. Because again, we can't delude ourselves and think, well, if we have a lockdown, we will stop everyone from getting the virus forever. We won't, and the vaccine is quite a far way off.
Right.
All we can do is slow down the spread. So I'll give you an interesting metaphor. If you think about buying a bottle of water with a very thin neck, and you turn that bottle upside down like this, the water will come out in a very explosive way. The other way you could do it is you could slowly pour the water out. Mm-hmm. And that's that sort of difference between the curves. So in both situations, the water will come out of the bottle. In other words, the population will get infected. But if it comes out slowly, it is in a less destructive manner. But there are certain people who, in other words, unless they seal themselves off from society, they are going to die. If you're elderly and you have lots of underlying conditions and you get COVID, whether you go to a hospital or not, you may die. There are certain people, in other words, who cannot be triaged. It's the triage set. It's those that could be saved if the hospitals are there, or if we've bought enough time for them for new treatments to become available. That's the sort of narrow band of people that we're looking to protect. And then we must, when doing this trade-off, we have to think, well, how many people are there, that we can save, and what are the consequences of saving them purely from a health perspective, because of the economic consequences that will happen from a continual lockdown or continual destruction of the economy.
I guess my point is that if there is no social distancing in the townships, then you will have that big spike, because what will happen is that the virus will spread very fast through the township. So that basically destroys the whole idea of having a lockdown in the first place. And when you consider what South Africa's economy is like before this happened, it was in shambles. Look at South African Airways, look at Eskom, look at Moody's putting the rand to junk. I mean, all the ANC government have done is they've tried to embrace a first world concept of flattening the curve, and they're not putting in the correct, or they're unable to put in the same parameters to flatten the curve because of what's happening in the township. So the whole idea of a lockdown is self-defeating because of that. Now, what I was suggesting is that what they should do is just get rid of the lockdown, and as you say, there are people who are vulnerable, like the elderly and people with ailments which are particularly susceptible to COVID-19. Isolate them. Let the rest of the community. The health minister said before we went in lockdown that he expects 60 to 70% of South Africans to get COVID-19. So it's going to happen. So if you isolated just those people who are vulnerable and let everybody else get on with their lives and get COVID-19, get sick, they'll come through the other side, they'll be fine. Your economy will still be there, but the extending this lockdown is destroying the South African economy. And as I said, that curve is going to go ballistic because of what's happening when it comes to social distancing in the township. So it's achieving nothing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I think that is one of the reasons why the government has imposed such a strong lockdown, is they're very concerned about people living in townships on top of each other. And I suppose the question is, it's worth finding out on the ground, what's happening there. What do the cases look like? We've done about, the last time I looked, about 95,000 tests. And I was when Mkhize had said,
peanuts.
Yes. So the plan was to do 30,000 a day by now. And we're doing 3,500, and we have been doing 3,500 for the last 3 weeks. So we're not pushing up the testing. And so the problem is, we look at our numbers and we say South Africa's doing a fantastic job because, our curve looks like it's flattening. We have a small number of deaths and a small number of cases, but that's, in other words, cases from tests.
Right.
That's not the same as true cases.
Yeah.
So we don't know what our real numbers look like. And I would think, as you say, working out what's happening in the townships is pretty vital, because a lot of the lockdown measures are intended to protect those people who live on top of each other. Now, it's not so straightforward, this notion that we could just isolate the sick and the elderly, because as you point out, sick and the elderly often live in townships with other people. So if their kids are going out and working or going to schools and getting sick, they're going to come home and they're not isolated from from their parents or their grandparents. So it's not clear that you can protect them with that sort of strategy.
But wouldn't that happen? Isn't that happening anyway because of the way they're confined into small spaces? So it really makes no difference, because that family is still coming through. And yeah,
it might be that it doesn't make no difference. It might be that it doesn't give you. Let's say the ideal scenario is you impose a lockdown and no one gets it. In other words, there is no spread. The virus dies after 21 days, and that's it. We defeated it.
Right.
That's very unlikely. But what we can have, in other words, is a slowing down of the spread. So Angela Merkel gave an interesting talk where she said, okay, if you think about that R value, which is the number of people that you are likely to infect. Okay, and so social distancing measures are going to affect that R value. And she says, at the moment, COVID has a certain R value, which is, let's say, under ordinary conditions, they reckon something like 2.5. So for every person that has it, they will infect 2.5 people. So that's why you get that rapid growth.
Right.
So if you can push the R value down below 1, eventually the thing dies out. She says, Germany at the moment, they're looking at about 1. She says, if you go to 1.1, they will exceed the amount of medical resources available in Germany by September.
Yeah.
If you go to 1.2 by August, by 1.3 June, So, and that's marginal. That's adding 10%. So that's what we're doing. In other words, we're not getting the perfect R0, but you are being able to reduce that R value. And so that means less people getting sick, less people spreading around. I do think the thing that you point out, which is important, is we can't take lessons from all countries. We're different. South Africa doesn't have the same setup as Italy does, in some good ways and some bad ways. So, for example, we know in Italy, particularly in the Lombardy region, very elderly population, and also one of the most polluted places in Europe. So, there's a reason why you had, why they have such a high mortality rate there, and a lot of those people had comorbidities. So, South Africa and Africa generally, our population doesn't look the same in terms of age. We look much more like a pyramid with very few old people at the top and lots of young people at the bottom. So our mortality rates by nation are going to look very different to what they're going to look like in countries like Italy, which have a much higher proportion of elderly people. I think it's the second highest in the world. So we have to have bespoke solutions based on where we're at. So Alex Broadbent, who's a professor of humanities at the University of Johannesburg, wrote a paper on this saying, look, he's a philosopher of science. He said, we can't just wholesale import solutions from other parts of the world because our situations are different. First of all, think about what the American economic stimulus package looked like. $2 trillion. What does South Africa's look like? Well, government started off by saying, well, we have 150 million rand, okay, so divide that by 19 or whatever the rand dollar is today to get you into your dollars, and put this into a basket. And the Oppenheimer family and the Ruperts have also decided to start funds up, and give us a billion rand. It's minuscule amounts of money to sort of deal with the economic thing. And you point out South Africa was already in a basket case economically. We're a fragile economy. We're not robust America or robust Germany or robust UK. So the amount of rope that we had available to ourselves is just different. So it's not that there is a one-size-fits-all solution. We have to think about what is going to work in South Africa, for our particular set. And we're now at this interesting stage. So there was some litigation from the alcohol industry in South Africa, which are prohibited from selling at this time, saying this lockdown measure is irrational and it's going to cost an enormous amount of jobs. I think just in the beer industry alone, there's 250,000 people that work there, and that's just directly. There's all the people who get work from the beer industry. So all those guys who are printing labels or who are doing marketing for Castle Lager or whatever it is, all those jobs. Right. And part of why we're seeing an alcohol ban in South Africa is a kind of morality police. So you have Becky Chele saying, geez, what's so wonderful about people not being able to drink is that we're not seeing all the assaults that we used to see in bars, and we're not having people drunk and driving on the road, and we should keep this measure in place after the lockdown because look how good it is to ban alcohol. Of course, there's a short memory problem there. The Americans tried this in the 20s, and prohibition doesn't work for extended periods of time because people like drinking, and so they'll find other ways to drink. They will, just because you have a law in place doesn't mean people will abide by that law. Right. And so you'll have a black market system. You will have organized crime networks that are able to flourish, and they will produce their own alcohol, which won't be, regulated and tested. And you'll have all these consequences that will occur, which are unintended. So that must be borne in mind. And again, all of the regulations that are in place must be there to stop the spread of COVID. They must not be there for any other kind of moralizing. You can't say, well, I'm a teetotaler and I don't like when people drink. The measure must be there to prevent the spread of the disease. And you have to ask, well, is this doing that? Is it rationally connected? Sufficiently so, and if it's not, well, then the regulation must be repealed.
Right. Now, I just want to say that just yesterday our Prime Minister in Australia said that the R factor is below 1 in Australia now, and they're very, very excited by that. Because we've had a lockdown, but it's been a very soft lockdown here. I mean, I can go and walk around the streets, I can take a bus and go somewhere else. You're really not really that restricted. Now, you raise the issue about the impact on business during the lockdown. There's an issue here which I'd love your point of view on, and that's to do with, I know AfriForum are involved in this. It's to do with the funds that have been put aside for industries like tourism, which are now being only given to or is it BEE compliant tourism establishments, which is clearly racist. And when you look at this COVID-19 situation, it doesn't discriminate on the basis of color. Everybody's been impacted. So to bring the race value into funding to keep businesses alive is wrong. Well, what are your views on that?
Yeah, so basically the original document that was circulated was, as you've described, in other words, that you would have businesses which are must be 51% black owned. Okay.
Right.
Now let's assume that you're a race nationalist and you think that race matters uber alles. All we care about is protecting black people. Okay, and anyone who doesn't fit into that racial group, well, we don't care about them. It's still nuts, because you can have a business which is, let's say, 50% owned by black people and 50% owned by white people, and all of their employees are black, and they would be disqualified.
Yeah.
Because they haven't met 51% ownership requirement, right? So, there's that nuts problem. Okay, so that was pointed out to government, and they backed away, and they said, oh, no, look, there was a draft, and that's not what we meant, and so they produced different regulations, but they're still race-based. So what they say is that 70% of the businesses that get benefits must be black-owned, and 50% must be owned by women, and a certain percent must be owned by people with disabilities. So they've still made it racially connected. Now, I think there's something very repugnant about that. As you say, all people's lives have value. We don't think that you are worth more because you're black or because you're white or because you're a man or because you're a woman. What you want to be doing is working out which are the industries that require the assistance. Now, part of the problem, as I say, is it's largely moot because there isn't enough money floating around. The amounts of economic assistance that can be put in place are minimal. But I will say this, which is, there's a book by Robert Higgs called Crisis and Leviathan, and it's about how states have tended to use a moment of crisis to enlarge their power. So in times of war or in times of disease, states kind of fill the void, and they're celebrated for doing so. People often want this sort of father figure to step in and make everything okay.
Right.
The problem is, once those rights have been limited, states sort of say, well, it's actually quite nice being able to do this. We quite like having all this power, and we think that people have actually been abusing their rights all along. And so even though the crisis is over, maybe we'll step back some of these things, but not all of them. So that's something to be incredibly vigilant about.
Right.
The other thing is we sort of think about a crisis creating an opportunity, and it creates an opportunity in two different ways. The one is for the bad actors, as I say, the kinds of authoritarians who want to be able to take control, abuse people, become strongmen dictators. It also creates opportunities for people with, radical economic visions. So the EFF, are an avowedly Marxist communist party, and they will see this as an opportunity to sort of run a strong agenda. The SACP have said, now is the time to bring in NHI. If only we had national health insurance, we wouldn't be in this mess. Now, I think if we had NHI, we'd be in a much, much worse mess.
Financially, it would destroy.
Financially, and from this perspective, if you don't trust government to keep the lights on, do you really trust them to sort of, keep the healthcare system running if they push out the private healthcare? Private healthcare in South Africa is actually world class. So as I say, we've got those dangerous bad actors. But there is also an opportunity for those that are more classically liberal, those that believe in free markets, because now is the time to say, hold on a second, BEE makes absolutely no sense in a time of crisis. If government needs to go and procure masks and ventilators and things like that, who cares who they buy it from? They must buy it at the cheapest price and get the best products. So, this is what a crisis requires. The other thing is we're going to be, once the pandemic is over, and it will be over, we're going to have a leveled economy. We're going to have a lot of people, out of jobs. We already had terrible unemployment, 30% unemployment. It's going to be much worse. So we have to say, well, we need to have very pro-growth policies so that people can be absorbed back into the labor market. Now, a lot of our labor laws have restricted people from entering the labor market. We're going to have to revisit that. So, for example, a minimum wage law, we generally think of, well, it's an important, humane thing. People should earn X rands per hour. But let me tell you, earning 0 rands an hour because you cannot get a job because no one's going to pay you minimum wage is much worse. And what's interesting about government's minimum wage is that it's immediately exempted itself. So there are a whole bunch of kind of busy work jobs that government has, people who kind of hold up flags on roads or whatever it is, and government said, we can't pay these guys 15 rand an hour, that's outrageous, we're going to pay them 10 rand an hour, we're going to exempt ourselves.
Right.
So there's going to be a lot of people, who would say, we are now a hobbled business. We're in this difficult scenario after COVID, we want to try and employ people, we can't pay them what we used to pay them. So we're going to have to scrap things like minimum wage. We're going to have to scrap a lot of the BE stuff as well because it's not particularly pro-labor. BE, if we think about it, the purported purpose, is to empower black people. Okay, has it done it? Well, no. What it's done is it's empowered a rarefied elite because you get BE points not from how many people you employ, but black ownership in your business. So there's nothing broad-based about it at all. It's sort of allowed for a kleptocratic elite to take advantage of a system. So those sorts of things people should be pushing against. The other thing, which is going to be vital to push against, is expropriation without compensation.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a short while. We'll come to that in a moment. I just want to raise a couple of issues here. And that is, before I look at the others, a lot of people believe that this lockdown is actually a rehearsal for seeing how compliant people are when they're put into this sort of position. And it's a conspiracy, and I accept it's a conspiracy. But the suggestion is now that I believe there's a deep state, and that the deep state are now using this to see how easy it is to get the whole population of countries like the US and Australia, and South Africa, or wherever, Europe, to actually go into isolation, lockdown, so that they can do their dastardly deeds in the future. Now, what are your thoughts about that?
Okay, so let's start with the kind of usual conspiracy theorists' opening question, which is, who benefits from the situation? Okay? So they identify a party that benefits, and they say they must be behind this. So who's benefited the most from COVID at the moment? Well, there's one company that springs to mind. It's Zoom, right? The video conferencing thing. They used to have 10 million users, they now have 200 million users. All these people are using Zoom. They weren't using Zoom before. They have benefited dramatically. They've got this massive user base. Therefore, they must be behind COVID. No. So what you'll find is that certain things will happen and certain people will benefit and certain people will take advantage. Now, I think you're right. In other words, if you have an authoritarian bent and you say, look how the whole world kind of went into submission during this time, that's interesting information. If we wanted to take power, this would be a useful thing to have orchestrated. It doesn't mean they orchestrated. It doesn't mean that anyone made the virus in a lab or anything along those lines. But I do think the point, the sort of sensible point is to say, well, there are bad actors around, and we need to be vigilant. We need to make sure that we get our freedoms back when the time is right. Now, one of the things that I've been working on at the moment is a report of what are our constitutional rights, how are they being limited by the regulations, and then sort of having cases of this happening. So, for example, one of the things that's banned in South Africa is holding a wedding ceremony. So there was a couple that were arrested along with their 50 guests, and there's something incredibly sad about that. It's sort of this very joyous occasion, and on their day of their wedding, the bride and groom were sitting in a prison cell, and that's a horrible thing. But we also know that certain kinds of events were these super spreader events that people going to these big public gatherings often were big vectors for the disease. So we can see some kind of rationale while accepting that it's an awful thing to impose on society. But merely in the act of neutrally logging our rights, we can remind ourselves of what a normal society should look like, what these restrictions are, and then we can start to do that evaluation process and say, well, should this restriction be here now? And then afterwards, we definitely know it shouldn't be there. So we don't want the Becky Shelleys of the world saying, well, we're going to keep alcohol banned in South Africa because, we're the morality police. We had a right to drink before and we must get it again. And businesses have a right to sell their products.
Right. Now, AfriForum, just for the record, has an excellent, on its webpage, has an excellent piece on your rights and all that sort of information about what your rights are during the lockdown. And I suggest that everybody watching goes and has a look at that page. Now, talking about rights, and we're talking about free speech, one of the first things that Ramaphosa did with the lockdown was he said that any fake reporting on the coronavirus would automatically result in a fine and possibly up to 6 months behind bars. And there have been a couple of people who have been arrested for putting out stuff on social media that's gone viral. Now, I have a huge concern about this, because what they're doing is they're controlling the narrative. So you've got the Minister of Health going out there and saying, this is the official position. There are now 2,500 infections in South Africa. We are controlling this thing. And no one is allowed to actually challenge that because of this new legislation. What are your views on that?
Okay, so I suppose the one is we must look at what legislation says. It's not quite as broad as disseminating false information. What it says is, if you intend to deceive someone about COVID, about someone's COVID status, or about government efforts to address COVID, then that is a crime punishable by up to 6 months. So we do have, one of the instances I can think of is a guy who made a video where he's got a swab up his nose, and he says, government is going to send people around to come and test you, and there's a concern that the tests might be themselves infected with COVID. He refers to an Evening Standard article where he says this is what happened in the UK, and he says, until we know whether the tests are safe, don't take the tests. Okay. So the Democratic Alliance laid a complaint against him, and he was arrested. So it's interesting that it wasn't the ANC laying the complaint, it was the opposition. Now, I think it's probably quite unlikely that this person intended to deceive anyone. He probably believed it. In other words, he might have been saying something false. In other words, the idea that the tests are contaminated, even though he doesn't actually say that. He says they might be contaminated, and we should wait until they're checked. So there's a concern about that, because what you want is people to be able to freely exchange information. In a normal society, we say people are allowed to say things that are false because we believe that truth will ultimately win out. Now, I think it is the case that the old saying is that gossip and false information have gotten halfway around the world before the truth has even got its socks on, and that's true. But the truth does catch up, and eventually, in the light of day, it can show false information to be what it is. Now, the problem is when you're dealing with a crisis situation, do you have the time, to sort of allow the truth to catch up? And so there might be some reason to try and limit speech, but we must be very, very wary about doing that, because as I say, our freedoms aren't won. We don't put them in the bag. We have to fight for them continually, because they're always under threat. And to my mind, the better way of combating something that's fake is to point out that it's fake and say, well, let me tell you why this person's view is incorrect. Here's the other worry about that law. As I say, I think the way you described it is exactly how most people describe it, which is if you disseminate false information, they forget about the intention bit. And so they might say, I've got this bit of information, I don't know if it's true or not. It might be true, but I don't want to get 6 months in prison, so I'm not going to share it. And what happens is that a bunch of true information doesn't get shared, which might be incredibly useful. I think it's important that people are able to have an open discussion during this time, so we can find out what's actually true. We know that we have a big data problem. So we don't know, for example, how many people actually have COVID, because we haven't tested the whole population. We have some ideas, we have some modeling, but we don't really know. We don't know what the true mortality rates are. If we look at what the mortality rate looks like in the UK and in Italy, it's over 10%. But if you look at other parts of the world, it's less than 1%. Why? So we need to find out. Is it the population? Is it other factors? There's a view. One of the interesting views is that countries that have had the BCG vaccine, which is meant to guard against tuberculosis, are doing a lot better than countries that don't have the mandatory vaccine. You can look at a map of the world of BCG and a map of the world of COVID, and you can see there's quite a good overlap. And so that might be reason to think that BCG is playing an important role there. It might be that there's a third factor, which is those countries that have high rates of COVID mortality rates also big tourist destinations. So, and might be more compact and might be better at doing testing in a way that, Africa is not getting the same amount of choices, is not doing the same amount of testing.
Right.
That's why the case in Africa is so small. So, but we need to have this open dialogue. We need to be able to disagree with each other to test our intuitions. So, yeah, when we silence speech and we make it criminal to talk about the topic, we lose out on very important information which might save lives.
Yeah, exactly. Now, just about that guy who had the earbug up his nose, it's interesting because a few days before he actually published that video and put it into social media, there were reports in several newspapers in the UK, and I've seen them, the online reports, where they were saying that some of the testing kits they were getting from Europe, which had been, I think, compiled in China. I don't understand the route they come through, but some of the swabs were found to have COVID-19 on them. And that's obviously where he got his information from. I mean, those reports you can go and have a look at, and you can see the timeline. So I think his intention was good, but clearly it's backfired very badly on him. Now, a short while ago, you were mentioning about expropriation without compensation. This is a huge area. Would you like to just introduce the whole subject and its implications to South Africa?
Yes, sure. All right. So basically, in I think it's 2017 at the ANC's sort of internal party conference to work out who would be president of the party. This notion of expropriation or compensation was sort of mooted, and Ramaphosa at the time was successful, but very marginally so, and he championed this cause of expropriation or compensation. And he has continued to champion this cause of expropriation or compensation. So there are many people in business and who are middle class who say, well, as much as the president says, we are going to have expropriation or compensation, he doesn't mean it. He's just saying that to quell the bad guys in the ANC. So I've been talking about this topic for a long time now. I've written submissions, and I've always said, well, here's the choice that you face, which is either Ramaphosa is a thief or he's a liar. He's a thief if he believes in expropriation or compensation, because when you take someone's property from them and give them nothing for it, that is theft. Or he's lying. In other words, he doesn't believe it, and he won't do it. Those are your choices. Neither of them are good choices. People's best case scenario is to believe that Ramaphosa is a liar. So what is the rationale for expropriation or compensation? Well, the way it's been reported is to say, well, we have to have this to redress the wrongs of the past. So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to acknowledge that South Africa has a dark history of land confiscation. That during the colonial era, during apartheid, people who owned land had it taken from them by the state and were often paid small amounts of compensation or paid nothing, and they deserve compensation. And the question is, what has been done to do that, to redress that wrong? Well, from 1995 to 2014, we had a land claims court process, and so anyone who had their land taken from them could participate in this process. And they could receive either their land back or financial compensation. And what happened is that 1.8 million individuals had their claims settled. So we know that an enormous amount has been done to redress the wrongs of the past. Something else interesting, which is that when given the choice, 92% of people said, I'd like the money, please. They didn't want the land back.
Yeah.
And when you poll South Africans on what are the burning issues in the country, these are pre-COVID polls, what you find is that 40% of people said it's unemployment, and I think it's less than 2% said land reform. So, this idea that there is a burning desire for people to have land is just not the case. People don't want a far-flung piece of rural land in the middle of nowhere. They want to live in cities. They want money so they can start a business, pay off their debts, or buy a piece of land in an area where they'd actually like to live. So, the underlying rationale for EWC is false. It also has all these terrible consequences. So, if we think about countries that have utilized this idea, it's not a new idea. We can look at Zimbabwe and we can look at Venezuela. So, there the states confiscated people's land. And it didn't just have negative effects on the people who lost their land. So if we think about, the farmers in Zim who had their farms taken from them, not only them that lost out, it's all Zimbabweans, because the economy completely tanked. They had the world's worst case of hyperinflation.
Right.
Basically money became completely worthless. It was cheaper to use notes than toilet paper. They obliterated their economy. They had 90% unemployment. And you can look at Venezuela. You had what people refer to the Maduro diet. People lost like 30 kilos because the economy got so badly tanked. 2.5 million people were driven into exile. It's because they were trying to escape the effects of communism. So it's not like it's a novel and we can try it and it'll work for us. And South Africans unfortunately have this delusion that we're special, because we have in some ways a special story to tell. We avoided a civil war, we had a peaceful transition, and so we think that we can do things that other nations have tried and failed at, and we'll get it right. But I'm sorry, our luck is going to run out on that front. And it was a terrible idea pre-COVID. Post-COVID, it's utter insanity. So those that are being targeted, primarily we talk about farmers. Although if we look at the kind of constitutional amendment, it goes well beyond farmers, and I'll explain that. But let's just think about the farmers for a second. So they were sort of seen as these soft targets. When Pitu has his farm and has all this money, and we can take his stuff and we can give it to people, and that's what justice requires. Now those guys are producing food, for a nation that may well face starvation after COVID. So we need to protect their rights now more than ever. But if we're going to look at what was actually envisioned in that constitutional amendment, it was land and improvements. So it's not all property, it's not your car, it's not your shares, but it is your house. Your house is an improvement on your land, so that's all residential homes. Your business, which is built on a piece of land, would also be subject to compensation, so your factory. So all the things that are going to be absolutely vital in keeping South Africa ticking over in a post-COVID world, all those things are endangered. That's nuts. So, as I say, now is an opportunity to say EWC must be completely shelved. It was a bad idea before. It's the worst possible idea now. We need to secure property rights. We need to make sure that our economy can be sort of turbocharged, because we're really going to need it.
Right. Now, I must just say that I think that the thing that's really killed the economy in South Africa is black economic empowerment, because people have been put into positions where they're incapable, they're incompetent, and in many cases they are corrupt. Now, on this channel we call that special privileged class, which Ramaphosa and his mates live in, black privileged. We have a special term for them. And I think, as you said earlier, the general black population get none of the benefits of this so-called broad-based black economic empowerment. Now, we're talking here about expropriation without compensation. Does that extend to things like pension funds, the money in your bank account, the jewelry that you wear? Is it limited to just real estate property and land, or does it extend to other areas?
Okay, so if you read how the Constitution currently stands, what it says is that all property can be expropriated with compensation. Okay, so property is a broad class. All the things that you've mentioned, including intellectual property, are going to be in that property class. But when you pay compensation, you then follow a particular formula, which is, the first is, what is the market value?
Right.
And then we look at 4 other factors. So we say, what's the purpose of the expropriation? Did you receive a loan to acquire the asset? So for example, let's say you got R1 million from the state to buy a farm, and the farm is worth R1 million. We can set that off against the value, and so we could pay someone R0 in compensation under the current formulation. Okay, what the amendment does is basically say all land and improvements can be subject to expropriation with nil compensation, with factors to be determined through national legislation. Now, the concern with that is, as I say, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And what this amendment would do is to say, instead of looking at the Constitution, we'll look at national legislation, and that will determine it. Now, why do that? Well, it's very hard to change the Constitution. It requires 2/3 to change the Bill of Rights. Now, the ANC on its own does not have 2/3. They have 57.5%. With the EFF, they do have 2/3. But if you want to pass order legislation, all you require is 50 plus 1. So, and you can change it, over and over and over again. So your first draft might look very reasonable, but your later drafts might get more and more draconian. Now, one of the things we must remember is when you start changing the law, it's not that the person who changes it will be the person who governs it. It'll be successive generations down the line.
Right.
And we can imagine a society like America where you have a constant change of power between Democrats and Republicans, that they're acutely aware of this. So they don't want to give the opposition a weapon which will be used to bludgeon them over their heads with. So don't draft laws which will, be used against you at some later date. Now, the ANC have been comfortably in power with the council majority since 1994, but that may not always be the case. So, right now they might be drafting this kind of law and saying, well, we'll use this to punish our political enemies. So if you vote for the IFP, well, we're going to come take your land. Or if you're an EFF supporter, we'll be coming after you. Or if you're a DA guy. But what happens when the tide shifts? It might be that ANC supporters are targeted. We must also think of who is going to actually be using it. It's not going to be Ramaphosa. It is going to be, the executive. This is the other thing, is that, the ANC have said they don't like the current language because it gives the courts the ability to determine price. They say it must be the executive. Well, the executive is not just the president and cabinet. It's mayors all around the country.
Right.
So it's little petty bureaucrats who are going to settle, feuds, saying, well, I think you looked at my wife a little bit funny in the shops the other day, so I'm going to come and take your land. Or you're part of the wrong tribe, so we're going to come take your land. So that's an incredibly dangerous thing to hand over.
Right. Now, what actually makes that even more dangerous is what happens if the EFF get into power. I mean, can you imagine what they're going to do with a law like that?
Yes. Yeah. It's a big concern. So, I mean, what the EFF have said is, what they really want is no property rights whatsoever. They want total nationalization.
Right.
Now, here's an interesting thing. I don't know if you've watched Andile Mgatama from the BLF's submission to Parliament on this question. So, Andile says the idea of allowing nationalization of all land is completely crazy. He says the EFF will become kings and the rest of us will become serfs. He says, I don't trust Julius Malema, to own all the land and, let me live on it as a servant. Now, Andile used to be a part of the EFF, and obviously represents his own completely nutty radical organization.
Right.
And even he can see that this is a terrible idea.
Right. Now, something we haven't touched on, but I think we need to, is the self-defense issue of the minority groups. Because the police minister, Becky Cele, has been basically impinging on the rights to self-defend. We had the case of a farm attack where a farmer shot one of the invaders in his house and killed him, and he is now up for murder, which to me is just absolutely crazy. And then we have the situation where just last week Becky Cele said you can no longer have these response groups driving around protecting farms. It's like they're stripping away the layers of defense for our most vulnerable people. What are your views on this issue with the self-defense law and what they're doing with gun rights right now, which I think is just absolutely disgusting, and the fact that they're stripping away the ability for farmers to have these groups to protect them?
Yeah, it is a concern. So we don't have a constitutional right to bear arms in South Africa like they do in America. And what's interesting is if you go and look at the American Constitution as to what was the purpose of having a gun right, it was to protect yourself against the state. So we often think about guns for personal defense, against criminal elements. They saw it as, a protection against the state.
Right.
Why did they think that? Well, part of it was because they just gained their independence from a pernicious state, the British, right? And they sort of saw that states can become sinister and that you may need to protect yourselves against them. Now, we may be seeing that in other countries. So in Venezuela, for example, Venezuelans stripped people of their gun rights before they started stripping them of their other civil liberties. So, first they take your guns, and you say, okay, well, I guess that's okay. We take away people's guns, and that'll take away the guns from the criminals as well. I'm sure that'll work. And then the state comes after you for all sorts of other things, and you have no means of protecting yourself. Now, I always say to South Africans, the state really can only govern with your consent, practically, because we outnumber, the police and the army multiple folds. Really there has to be some level of buy-in, from the state, because they don't have the resources to properly police everybody. We've seen now in a time of crisis. So they have to have some level of legitimacy. And so the threat of, in other words, if the populace does have their own guns, and if there is a point in time where the state acts in a highly authoritarian and immoral manner, if the citizens can say, we will protect ourselves against that, that is a deterrent against the state infringing upon their rights.
Right.
So that's something that's is important to bear in mind. What's interesting, of course, is that in America, I think as a citizen, you have no chance whatsoever of protecting yourself from the state, because the state is so well armed. Their small town police stations, have sophisticated SWAT teams. I mean, these guys come in, in full armor and, like riot gear and semi-automatic rifles. As a citizen, you have no chance against the state if it ever turns against you. In South Africa, you may have more of a chance. Now, obviously, you don't want that to happen. You don't want citizens, having these kind of violent clashes with the state. I mean, the kind of rationale that's being sold for gun control is, if we just ban the guns, then criminals won't have guns. The answer is, if you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns. Or they'll move to other methods for killing. So you'll have knife attacks. Like in the UK, it's quite hard to get a gun, but you've had a big surge of knife attacks, and people will die in that way. You might think that there are certain kinds of weapons that might be useful to restrict. I mean, you could have a debate about automatic guns, or on an extreme end, should people be allowed to have their own personal tanks or their own personal aircraft? Is that necessary for self-defense? Probably not against criminals, but maybe against the Finnish state. It's at least a question we're thinking about. But yeah, on the real issue that we have, as you say, is farmers who are in a position where the state's not protecting them anymore, where they are vulnerable and they are being attacked, they should at least retain the right to self-defense. Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher, wrote a book called Leviathan. It's about the role of the state. And really the purpose of the state, he says, is that if we don't have the state, we will lead a life that is nasty, brutish, and short. There will be the war of all against all. We will have anarchy. And the purpose of the state really is to sort of have this function of protection, that we all work better with the state. But once the state starts to infringe upon your rights, well, then you retain all of those rights of yourself, and you must be able to protect yourself from the state.
Right. Now, I just want to address the side chat and people watching the video right now. We'll be taking your questions shortly. And I have a question here from Tace, which is related to what we're just talking about. And he says, why did Cele stop the neighborhood watch? What is the idea about that?
Yeah, from what I gather, so certain things were declared as essential services. Private security were declared as an essential service, thank goodness. I think the number of private security guards in South Africa is about 500,000. They are the biggest employer beyond government, and obviously vital during this time. A whole bunch of people are going to require security service protection. Now, but as you say, you've got these other things that are not, let's say, private security accredited, but are communities who look after themselves. And it seems quite important for communities to play this role at this time. So it's unclear I try not to work out what people's underlying motivations are. It's often not that apparent. I mean, the one is, there's a suspicion about, people being able to protect themselves, and this is a useful opportunity to take away their rights. And the other one is it's just part of a general thing of keeping people at home and not seeing these community watch services as essential, and that's the reason for why they're being stopped. But I think we have to think about, when we think about the role of the state during a time of crisis, it cannot go it alone. So the state cannot do everything for us. It doesn't have the resources. It cannot protect all its citizens. It cannot produce all the things that we're going to need. That has to be done by private individuals and also by communities. So communities are going to be able to play a very important role in addressing COVID-related concerns. So they're going to be able to protect themselves. They're going to be able to build field hospitals, maybe often in the schools that have closed down. So, I think it's important that communities push back and say, we have a role to play here and we can do a lot of good and you shouldn't be shutting us out.
Sorry, I've got a question here from Tertia, and she says, please ask about hostile working environment, not words but unfair actions in workplace, please.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what Tertia's getting at, so I'll try and understand the question. I'm assuming she sort of means in an ordinary environment, you're at work and things are hostile. What do you do about it?
Right.
Well, look, we do have labor laws to try and deal with those sorts of situations. I suppose there'll be internal structures in place inside of a business for people to kind of register their complaints about how they're being treated, and some of that stuff is actionable. So we have some body of law around, let's say, sexual harassment, and it's the kind of thing that you could litigate over or deal with internally. I think there has been a greater conscientizing of people about inter-work hostility. There's certain things people aren't willing to tolerate anymore, and they can sort of exercise their rights in that manner, I suppose.
Right. Now, did you see that advert by Solidarity that DSTV banned?
No. What was the ad?
Okay, the ad was forward to DSTV to run on their programs, but they said, no, we're not going to run it. Basically, they banned it. And I've actually seen the ad, and I've actually got a video of this particular subject. And in the ad, Solidarity have different people portraying different careers, and this is what they're talking about, is basically how we support you. And the problem with the ad was that all the people in the ad were white people. And that ad was banned by DSTV. What are your thoughts of that?
All right, so this is a quite nice fundamental question around free speech. So when we think about banning things, traditionally the way we've talked about banning is from the state. In other words, the state says we are censoring this thing and we will not allow it, and we will not allow this book to be published or this thing to be flighted. So during apartheid, the state was quite good at doing this. In other words, efficient at doing it. They managed to ban a lot of books. They had huge lists of songs that were banned. The book Black Beauty was banned. Things they deemed vulgar, pornographic material, all that stuff was banned by the state.
Right.
That's very hard to do in an internet age. It's very hard to stop someone from seeing that. As you point out, you have seen the ad. I take it that it's available online. So what you have here is DSTV saying we're refusing to flight your ad. Now, it's a certain kind of banning. I suppose you've got this tension now between free speech and private property. So, DSTV might say, we're a private organization, and you cannot compel us to air anything. We have the freedom to decide what we're going to air. Now, if they exercise that freedom in a discriminatory manner, let's say they say, we don't like Solidarity, we don't like their values, we don't like that the people in their ad are white,
right.
People might then exercise their freedom to boycott DSTV. So I know that Steve Hofmeyr ran a boycott campaign against DSTV, and he smashes the code and asks other people to do that. That's part of what you want in a free society, is that people are able to say, well, you're exercising your freedom, I'm going to exercise mine. The other kind of thing that when we think about free speech is there's the right to free speech, and there's also the culture of free speech. So part of having a culture of free speech is that you allow people to air views that you disagree with. When you say that you tolerate something, it doesn't mean that you agree with it. We don't tolerate things that we like. I don't tolerate chocolate and ice cream. I tolerate someone smoking close to me. I don't like it when they smoke, but I say, fine, you have the right to do so, and I will tolerate it. So you might think that, as a big broadcaster, you should be tolerant, and that you should allow a range of different views to be expressed in your forum. And even if you don't have a legal obligation to do so, that you might have some kind of moral obligation to allow for a variety of views.
Right. Okay, now we've got a number of questions that are coming through. St. Sent Longinus. That's an interesting username. Asks Mr. Oppenheimer, which group decides what is hate speech?
Okay, so as I said earlier, we have these different definitions. We've got a constitutional definition, we've got legislative definitions, and then we have colloquial definitions. I suppose, as you say, there's this kind of battle for the soul of what is hate speech. So there are some people who are going to say, they're going to agree with the constitutional line. They're going to say, well, it's this advocacy of hatred against one of these groups, and that constitutes an incitement to cause harm. Other people will say, hate speech is all the speech that I don't like. If you say things that I disagree with, that's hate speech. And they will try and define that around their particular group parameters. What we want to do is have some sort of sophisticated understanding about what these terms are. I think it's quite important that we have certainty about what words mean, and we shouldn't abuse language because it can lead to all sorts of negative externalities. We want to know what we're talking about, and that's why I liked the opening distinction between hateful speech, let's say racist speech. We think it's hateful, but it's not genuine hate speech. We might tolerate racist speech. I'll tell you one of the reasons why we might want to tolerate racist speech. So I think if people say racist things, they're doing something quite despicable. But I also want to know how big a problem it is in our society. How many people are saying racist things? So we can work out how many resources do we need to address the problem through counter-dialogue efforts, through raising awareness. So my background is Jewish. Okay, my grandparents fled Nazi Germany. Okay, they managed to escape the Holocaust because they came to South Africa as refugees. Now, I think if someone waves around a swastika or denies the Holocaust, they are despicable. But I think they should have the freedom to do that. So I can see in a society how many people don't believe in the Holocaust. Because then we know if that becomes a widely held belief, well, we need to spend much more effort on Holocaust awareness so that people know about what actually happened. If you ban it, if you say you cannot utter those words, well, then we lose all that information. We don't know how many people hold the false belief that there was no Holocaust. So we don't know how to address it. And the other thing is when you ban things, you give people an opportunity to say, well, the reason why they've banned is because they don't want the truth to come out, because of the Jewish conspiracy, whatever it is. Right. And so in the dark, unregulated, parts of the world, these ideas will flourish. In the light of day, they don't flourish. Right. Sunshine is sort of, best remedy to really bad ideas. So a friend of mine, Jeremy Nell, the cartoonist, has a YouTube channel called Germ Warfare, and he's got an interesting approach to the way that he deals with his guests. So there's a philosopher, Peter Boghossian, who wrote a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations. And he says, often we don't make that much progress in conversation if it's very adversarial, if we're fighting with the person and trying to say why they're wrong. But if we allow the person to speak, and if we try and understand their position, and then we put to them their position in all of its splendor, and we point out the contradictions in their position, that person might change their minds. And so Germ has had some really interesting guests on the show, one of whom is a guy called Mark Sargent, who heads up the Flat Earth Society. Now, I'd always thought the Flat Earth Society was a kind of joke. It turns out that some of these guys are genuine believers in the Flat Earth. And it's pretty interesting having someone like that express their views. Right. And what Germ did was say, well, I want to hear why you believe what you believe. Explain it to me. Give me all the detail. And I think what that does is it allows people to interrogate the idea. Right. It also makes people think, they go, well, I know the Earth is not flat. I know it's geoid-shaped. I know that. And they have to start thinking about, this belief that they held and try and find some supporting evidence, because they're challenged with a very out there idea. And that's quite useful. That's the advantage of hearing things that we disagree with, is that they make us reinvestigate the things that we hold to be true. And sometimes we'll now support what we hold to be true and find out really why it's true. And sometimes we'll change our minds for the better. And that's why, as I say, you want this free flow information. Right. Now, we had a much more controversial guest on a couple of days ago in the form of David Icke. Now, David Icke is a world-renowned conspiracy theorist. He believes all sorts of absolutely insane things. So in the 90s, he wrote a series of books His underlying idea is that there's a new world order, and the new world order is composed of people from the fourth dimension who are not really people, they are lizards. And he says the Queen is a lizard, and the Rothschilds are lizards, and he has this completely, utterly insane view. And his views on COVID are also equally insane. He says stuff like, there is no virus, just kind of follow the money and look who's benefiting, and they must have put this in place, and the whole thing's a hoax.
Yeah.
But it's useful to hear guys like Ike so that you can sort of explore the idea, interrogate it, and realize why he holds some bizarre views, and it'll probably strengthen views that are actually true. I mean, I will say Jerm has had some incredible doctors on his show and some of the world's top epidemiologists on his show, and allowing people to sort of think about things from different spectrums is incredibly useful, and we need to support that kind of free, open dialogue.
Right, okay, we got another question from the same fellow. We've got a bunch of questions here, we'll get to them. He says, please ask Mr. Oppenheimer to identify the elites he has mentioned.
I suppose in relation to BE, that's when I've spoken about elites.
Yeah.
So look, I'll tell you, I've written quite a lot on BE. So my view is that I'm in favor of affirmative action. I'm in favor of non-racial affirmative action. So I think that if you have personally suffered an injustice, justice requires that you are then personally compensated. I think that's how legal systems generally work. If you suffered a wrong, you should be put back in the position that you would have been had the wrong not occurred.
Right.
Now, we know in South Africa that apartheid was racially driven. It was, race was the source of our problems. But that doesn't mean that it needs to be the source of our solutions. Because, race is a very blunt instrument. We cannot say that because you are a part of a particular race that says certain things about you. So, for example, I can't say because I'm Jewish that I survived the Holocaust. I didn't. My family did. There are other Jews that have, but I personally didn't. I can have a connection to it in a sort of spiritual sense, but I didn't go through that. So when you're assessing whether someone has been wrong, you need to look at their particular situation. If you want to use proxies, well, race is a very poor proxy for disadvantage. You can use actual disadvantage. And so, people often say to me, but that seems so complicated, and why can't we use race? And so, it's so much easier just to use race, to look at the person's skin color. I'll give you a couple of problems. First is, South Africa has one of the biggest non-racial compensation schemes in the world, in the form of social grants. 18 million people in South Africa receive social grants, and we don't ask them what skin color they have. We look at other factors, neutral factors, like how much money do you earn? Are you a child? Are you a pensioner? Are you disabled? Those are the kinds of markers for disadvantage which are race neutral, which we can use to compensate people. Now, the problem is, if you use race as a proxy, you wind up benefiting the wrong set of people. So who is most likely to benefit from a race-based affirmative action scheme in the corporate sector? It's not likely to be the person who was locked out of the economy by apartheid, who was not given the opportunity to study at a university. All of those people have suffered a wrong, and we need to find a way to redress their wrongs. But they don't even get to compete in the corporate sector because they don't have the capacity to. They don't have the law degree or the commerce degree or whatever it is that would allow them to compete. So who are those that are there? It's those that are advantaged. It's those that don't actually need the leg up. And often what you find is that the person who is given this benefit, a lot of them would have gotten there anyway. In other words, in a free open market, if you are a smart person, you will get the job. And a lot of those people that are smart are black people. They would have gotten the job anyway. And the concern with having BE in place is that you have this skepticism. People say, the only reason that person has the job is because they're black. And they have to wear this millstone around their necks all the time of a presumed inferiority. They said, no, actually I was the best in my class and I did much better than all those white kids and I worked bloody hard. And that's why I'm a competent lawyer or accountant or whatever it is.
Right.
And I don't like the accusation, that I'm here because I'm black. So, if you treat people like human beings, that is a much better way of moving to an equal society. What we've found is that the unintended consequence would be is that you have a lot more racial resentment. A lot of people say, well, I missed out on that job because of my skin color. It might be that maybe that's the case. I think that is becoming more and more the case, that a lot of people are being told they cannot work in a place because they are white or because they are men.
Right.
But some of those people wouldn't have gotten the job anyway because they're just not very good. And so they can now use the sort of BE as a foil for explaining their own inadequacies. But I do think you can have redress measures. I think you could have a system in place to say, if you were denied opportunities unfairly, or you speak English as a second or third language, we should have some redress measures for you. We should make it easier for you. And the question is where you do that. So you might think you should do that in an education environment so people can sufficiently skill up. So at universities, you might think that you help those that are in need, and there have been needs-based scholarships for a long time, and that seems important. But you think, well, once you've now graduated, freely compete, and that it's not businesses' role to do it. Or you could think that businesses could have some spots available for those that are economically disadvantaged. There's another advantage to that kind of transformation policy, which is you can actually be transformed. You can enter a job poor, and you can scale up, and then you can become not poor. And you don't carry the sort of mark of poverty like the way that people carry their race. Your race is visible to others. People can see if you're black or you're white. They can't tell if you were poor 10 years ago. It changes, right. So you can actually be transformed and uplifted.
Now, Marissa Williamson has asked, how long do you think that this lockdown should last, in your opinion? And she says this is detrimental to our economy.
Yes. Okay, so I think we've got to ask ourselves a couple of important questions about what the purpose of the lockdown is, what we can achieve with it, whether those ends are good ends, and what the costs are. So there is a view which is that if you have a lockdown for 49 days, that is a sufficient period of time to get the disease under control, that you can then reopen without the catastrophic effects. That's an empirical question. I'm not sure if that's correct. It might be that as soon as you reopen, the disease comes back. Now, I think if you indefinitely have a lockdown, you are guaranteeing economic disaster, which will guarantee social unrest and all the health consequences attached to that. But it must be guided by evidence. It can't just be that we say, well, I'll live with 3 weeks, but a month is too long, or 5 weeks is too long because, that makes me personally uncomfortable. It must be guided by evidence. It must be guided by these twin goals of health and of the economy. And so that must be done by experts. As I say, if what we're trying to do is buy ourselves enough time to ensure that our hospitals are ready, then it might be that amount of time. And we must ask ourselves, well, is government doing enough to make sure that our hospitals are ready? Do we have enough field hospitals? Have we capacitated our resources? Have we got enough ventilators or whatever other treatments available? Maybe once we have that stuff, then we need to start opening the economy up. We need to allow people to get infected and treat them and have a high recovery rate and eventually build up to a normal society. Look, one of the concerns is that it might be the case that if you get sick, you can get sick again. We don't know. The assumption that we're operating under is that once you've gotten sick, you're then immune. There have been a couple of reports of people who've gotten sick again. It's unclear whether they're anomalies or whether it's generally the case. We have this data problem at the moment because we're dealing with something very new. And I think one of the problems is that because of the data problem, we're going to make the wrong decisions. They're going to be the wrong decisions with the knowledge of foresight. In other words, many years to come, we'll look back on what measures were taken by states around the world, and we'll be able to adjudicate whether they did the right thing or the wrong thing. At the moment, all we have is information in hand.
Right. Now, one of the areas that is of concern with this COVID-19 virus is the ability to mutate into something even more dangerous, which is what basically the influenza virus does. Now, I've got another question here from PE, who says, why has the Human Rights Commission closed down? I can't get hold of them.
I gather that a lot of organizations were not deemed essential. So, for example, there is a complaints body where you can complain about police abuses, which is closed during the lockdown. So, yeah, that is a concern, because I think civil liberties are going to be important. People are going to be running challenges, and bodies that can monitor that are important. And so I think it is important that people are able to get in touch with IPID and get in touch with the Human Rights Commission. But in their absence, I think other organizations will fill the void. So there are other civil society organizations that will play an important role in monitoring state abuses. So AfriForum, for example, have said that you can write to them if your rights are being violated, and so that they can take action if necessary. So yeah, at least people are not left completely in the lurch on that front.
Right. Now there's a related question from Ron here, and he says, what about the abuse of citizens during lockdown and your rights? Now I know that AfriForum have on their homepage a whole piece on that Ron should go and have a look at. But do you want to answer the question?
Yes. So look, there's a couple of different ways in which you can have your rights vindicated. So my practice started out dealing with wrongful arrest and police brutality cases, and what we did in those cases would we would sue the Minister of Police. So to be financial compensation for the person who was beaten up by the police or wrongfully imprisoned. But that's typically done quite a while after the incident happens. And they would obviously prefer it if the incident didn't happen, but we try and restore some sense of dignity through financial compensation. And so there's still the ability to do that. In other words, if people are wrongfully treated by the police, they don't have total carte blanche, all of your rights, as I say, are still in place. If the police abuse their powers, they are liable. And so there are actions that can be taken afterwards. At the moment, it is quite hard to access a court. So courts have said they're only available for urgent matters and matters related to COVID. And that a lot of those hearings will be done either on paper or via video conferencing. They won't be done in person. So we have an access to courts problem at the moment.
Right.
But that may change. The other thing that you could try and do is to try and stop the police from acting in the way that they're acting if they are violating their rights. And I am aware of someone launching litigation basically doing that, seeking a declarative to say that the police must operate inside the law and they must not act in an abusive manner. So yeah, those are the sort of options available.
Right. Okay. Now Shirley's asked, could you please ask Mark his opinion on this lockdown, how it will affect us mentally?
Yeah, it's this completely bizarre global experiment we're running, which is, what do people do when they're not able to spend physical time with each other and not able to do the things that they're accustomed to doing? I think a lot of meaning in life comes from the loving bonds that you have with people in your life and from being able to do something that matters. And I think this time is going to be a big test of people's characters, and I think it's going to bring out the best and the worst in us. So some people will become very generous and will try and give of themselves as much as they can, and other people will try and hold on to what they have. So yeah, it will have these sort of emotional effects. I think there are interesting things people have done to try and deal with the psychological impact. There has been some sort of rise in creative projects. So a friend of mine started something about 2.5 weeks ago. He's quite a famous illustrator in Cape Town, and he said, if you can show to me that you've donated a certain amount of money to COVID, you put up a donation address, I will illustrate a portrait of you. And he was absolutely inundated with requests to raise an enormous amount of money and produce a bunch of beautiful art at the same time. His name is Koos Groenewald. He's Koos with 6 O's on Instagram. You can have a look at some of his work. So people have created these interesting things at this time. Yeah. I think also look back in history. This isn't totally unique. It's unique for our generation in some ways, but disease has always been prevalent, and people have quarantined themselves. So there are a number of artists who produce great works under times of quarantine. Great paintings, great works of literature. And I think once people get over the panic and the mental anxiety, they might be able to buckle down and do some of those great things that they've always had on the back burner. I know that I've been trying to take a lot of this time to work on some creative projects. And I hope others do that. I think it's a good way to kind of stay sane. One of the things that I've been doing for a couple of years, I have a background in theatre. When I was at school, we used to perform plays and read plays together. And so for the last couple of years, I've been getting friends together. We pick a play, we have a picnic, and we read the play together with accents. And it's a lot of fun. And we've now been doing that on Zoom. And I have to say, a wonderful activity. You feel connected. You're stepping into this other world.
Right.
You can kind of forget all the ordinary stuff that comes along with COVID, and very good for your mental health. So I would thoroughly recommend people doing that if they want to try and stay sane.
Okay, now, how many people can you actually get onto one Zoom live stream?
I was on one recently which had 100 people on it.
Wow. Okay.
So there are. It's quite amazing what you can do with it. I did one recently where we had. There's a panelist view that you can have, so you can just have the panelists talking to each other,
right?
And then you can have everyone else as a spectator. Or you can mute everyone's microphone so you don't have a cacophony of sound. So you can definitely you can run quite impressive big meetings on it.
Okay. Well, I raised that question because Marlena, who helps me with the live streams, and she's a very, very special lady in my life. And Glenn, pull your head in. Don't say rubbish, Marlena. You guzzle it, I know. That's just not acceptable, buddy. How's Sinette? I think you said she was snoring beside you. Now, Glenn, just so you know, Mark is an Australian like myself. Here it's nearly 6 o'clock in the morning. So when he said she was snoring, it was probably about 4 o'clock in the morning when he wrote that. Now, guys, we're going to be shutting down the live stream shortly, but there are still some questions I need to put to Mark. Marissa's asked, please ask Mark, why do the black South Africans say that they cannot get COVID-19?
It's an interesting thing. So one of the early bits of litigation that happened was there was a challenge to the lockdown. So the whole thing must be scrapped. The challenge was brought by the Holla Bonner Renaissance Foundation. And one of the claims that they made was that black people can't get COVID. Now, I gather that it's obviously not true. It seems to be something that sort of the idea came from the States. There was an idea that Asian people and European people were getting this, and there were no black cases. What is horrible is that what's coming out in the States is that black people seem more vulnerable. That the death rate among black people is like close to 3 times higher than it is of white people. Now, it's not because they have black skins and other people have white skins. It's because of it tracks with other kinds of comorbidities. So in America, there's higher rates of diabetes and asthma, which track with higher levels of fatalities there as well. So yeah, I think people definitely shouldn't labor under the misapprehension that this disease, if you have a particular race that you're going to be immune. That's very much not the case.
Right. Okay, now, Tersh has asked, is video footage illegal evidence, proof but illegal, where a troll doctor hits a white patient?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. So, look, in terms of, I can give you some kind of idea about evidence in court. What we have an interesting rule around evidence. So I'll give you a little way in which you can have regimes. So in America, they have this thing called fruits of the poison tree, which is if you illegally obtain evidence. So, for example, if we find the murder weapon in your house, but the police broke into your house to get it, it cannot be used in your criminal trial because it is a fruit of the poison tree because there was a criminal act to get it. In the UK, they have a different view, which is they say, no, if that evidence is relevant for the trial, we can use it, and we'll punish the police separately. In other words, they performed an act of trespass,
right.
Obviously punished, but we can use evidence. In South Africa, what we do is we say it's a matter of what is just in the circumstances, and it's a balancing act. So sometimes we allow evidence, sometimes we exclude it. Video evidence is often going to be useful if you can verify that it is accurate. I mean, video can obviously be doctored. There's
right.
Sorts of quite sophisticated ways of doctoring video. There is a rule about intercepting things. So, for example, this conversation, which we're both a party to, you're entitled to record. But you would not be entitled to plant a video in my house and record me without telling me. That would be an interception, and that would be, let's say, call it illegal evidence if you were to present it in a trial of me performing some crime.
Right.
So, that might help your question out a bit.
Well, it's interesting, this question, because you've heard of Project Veritas.
No.
Okay, I'll need to give you Project Veritas' link, because it's a guy in America who has what he calls citizen reporters, who are actually people who've got little cameras hidden on their bodies, and they go and they're like working within an organization, and they film, for example, CNN doing the wrong thing in a meeting where they're talking about how they're going to manipulate the news, and then they send that video back to Project Veritas, who then publishes it. And of course, there's this huge outcry in America by the mainstream media because they're being shown up as to what they're actually doing. So it's a very interesting area. Okay, next question.
Yes, those people, if they're party to the conversation, they are free to make those recordings. If they planted bugs in people's offices, then they would be performing a crime.
Yeah. Now this is when they're actually wearing the device. Horst has asked, what is the opinion of Mark regarding the maturity of black people in context 1, social distancing, 2, treatment of white people, 3, interpretation of laws, i.e. double morality?
Okay, so first of all, I just don't think we can make general claims about people on the grounds of race. So,
right.
In other words, to say all black people think X or all white people think X, I just don't buy it. So I don't think we can make any generalizations about what black people think or what Jews think or what Afrikaners think. So I don't buy it. I think there might be useful extrapolations you can make on other things. So in other words, what do lawyers think about free speech? They're specialists in that field. They might have some views. We could extrapolate interesting things about that. But I don't think there's such a thing as like race experts. I people hold a vast variety of beliefs.
Yeah, I get that and I accept that. That's quite right. But I'm just putting these questions to you that come out in the side chat. Okay, Aquapole has asked, and he's from the USA. He says, Mark, what about the legal recourse for people who are being forced to default on mortgages and car repayments when the government has crashed their income and the banks pursue them through the courts?
Yes. So one of the arguments might be, well, a couple of things. So what some banks have tried to do is give people holidays to say, look, we accept it as an unusual situation, and so you don't have to pay your home loan during this time. In South Africa, I think a lot of the big banks have done that, but not all the banks. So there is that kind of relief that's going on. I think some landlords are doing that, but you can't do it indefinitely. Someone is going to pay the bill for that eventually. Other bank customers are going to have to pay if people aren't paying their mortgages. The other line will be something like force majeure. So in a contract, the idea is if we agree to do something, I'll perform, if you do X, but then it becomes impossible to perform because of an act of God, that is a reason not to be able to perform. So we might find, that kind of being raised as a defense, people being able to say, well, I could not pay my mortgage because the state wouldn't allow me to work. We'll see how that pays off. Ramaphosa, in one of his addresses, said that he encouraged people not to rely on force majeure and not to stop paying their suppliers, because you can see the ramifications of people doing that is that eventually then everybody.
Sorry guys, we seem to have a little break here in the reception. Sorry, we lost the last 30 seconds. The line was very poor. Can you repeat the last 30 seconds there for us, Mark?
Yes, sure, with pleasure. So what I was saying was, you could rely on, and the argument would be to rely on force majeure, which is an act of God.
Right.
But the problem with people doing that is that it will have a ripple effect. So if people stop making payments to their suppliers, those suppliers won't be able to pay the people that they work with. So you can have this cascading domino effect in an economy. But that might be the way that people try and protect themselves from being sued. But it's probably one of the things that have to be tested. It's a completely unique situation because everyone is affected by the same force majeure.
Right. Okay. Now, I'm going to stop taking questions in a couple of minutes, guys, because it's getting late and I don't want Mark to be here for hours and hours and hours. I've got a question here from Aquapol who says, Mark, what about the legal recourse for people who have been forced... Oh, we've just covered that one. I've got so many questions here. Erica asks, Marissa asks, is it advisable for our kids to return to school? Please address this issue. I have 4 kids in school and I have asthma.
Okay, so as far as I understand, people that are asthmatic are much more at risk. The numbers I'd looked at were something like 8% mortality rates. So you might be a young, healthy person with asthma, and COVID could then be quite fatal for you. So a very close friend of mine is asthmatic, and he went into self-quarantine much earlier than everyone else because he's very concerned about getting sick. So I would think that that person has very good reason to try and protect themselves, and that schools are going to be a breeding ground for COVID. So the question, of course, is, well, what do I do about my kids? They need an education. And thank goodness we live in a world where education is freely available online from some of the best people around. So my friend Ramon Kabanek, who runs Morning Shot and the Renegade Report, has a young daughter, and she's been learning on Khan Academy. And he says it is just an absolutely incredible resource. Khan Academy's been running for a number of years, and it's free. And I think sort of specialized in math initially, but now does other things. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for kids learning, online.
Right.
I've got a friend who lives in Texas, and her 2 daughters were interacting with their teachers on laptops. So yeah, I would think that might be the wise measure in her particular circumstances.
Okay. Now, another question from Lucy. This is a good one. I like this one. Can I sue the government for destroying my business?
It's an interesting question. So I would. The short answer is probably going to be no, for a practical reason, which is what we call in the law of delict the floodgates problem. So let's think about Eskom blackouts. So Eskom failed to supply power. It breached its contract with people. A whole bunch of people's businesses closed. A lot of restaurants couldn't operate. People lost a lot of money. But there's this sort of safety net for defendants, which is that if you allowed people to litigate, and it would open the floodgates of litigation, then they don't have a right of action. So, and we've had that in our kind of common law for a long time. So I think it's very unlikely that she could do that. But the idea is that what you need for a delict is the intentional and wrongful acts. And so these are going to be done generally through law and with some good intent, let's say. But let's say you had a bunch of police officers, come into your place of business and loot stuff. Well, that's a good case where you could sue. They've acted intentionally and wrongfully, and you would have a good case. I don't think a lockdown effort is going to allow for any kind of big class action.
Right. Okay. Now, guys, I just want to say to everybody who's joined this live stream, thank you so much for being part of it. Those in the side chat, it's been quite a robust discussion in there. I've been following it, and thank you. And lovely to see Glenn here. It's been a while, Glenn. Sinet must be keeping you really busy. I'll just give you a bit of the background there, Mark. Glenn met Sinet, who actually lives in South Africa, through the Loving Life channel, actually on a live stream side chat, and now they're a couple, and they're together, and it's lovely when we have these little stories. We've actually got a few couples that have met on Loving Life through the side chat, and I sometimes think we have a dating site here, not a
you might even sort of change the name of the channel to Loving Each Other.
That's probably a good idea. But I just want to say to you, Mark, thank you so much for being on our channel tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you. As people are saying here, you really know your stuff, which is fantastic, because that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to let people know what their rights are, etc., etc. Is there something you would like to say to those people watching now and people who will watch this video later, just like a message about whatever you'd like to talk about, something on your mind?
Yes, so we spend a lot of time sort of talking about the problems that we're facing at the moment, and I do think now is a good time to be thinking about solutions. And there's we will come out of this. If you think about think about 1918. It's the end of the First World War. The Spanish flu is rife. 25% of the world's population gets sick. 50 million people die, and people emerge out of that into the roaring 20s, and you have a great period of flourishing, and so we will have human flourishing again. And what I think is important is that people use this time to think about, how do we make the new world that we step into a better world? How do we rebuild a lot of what we've lost? So I would say that diagnosing the problems is important, but being solution driven is even more important.
Right, and clearly there are going to be huge opportunities when we come out the other side.
I think so.
Okay, now, guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight. As I said just now, I'm so privileged to have Mark as a guest, and I'd love to have you back again, Mark, because there are a whole bunch of subjects we haven't got to, but it's getting late. I mean, things like, for example, you talked about genocide. I mean, there's this whole conversation about whether there's a genocide going on in South Africa right now against certain minority groups, and we haven't even got there. Things like secession and stuff like that. I mean, there's just a whole range of things that we just haven't. Do you want to just make a quick comment on those two?
Yes, sure. Okay, so I'll tell you what my view is on genocide. I think genocide is one of those things that you've got to be very vigilant for, that there are these markers for approaching a genocide.
Right.
And if you vilify people on the grounds of their race, their religion, or their culture, that is an escalation. And you can have these escalating racial tensions that can bubble up in violence. So I wrote a report for Solidarity for CERD, on this question around escalating racial tensions, and how we're sort of seeing some of that bubble over. Having said that, I don't think we have a genocide in South Africa. I think we have other kinds of things that are well worth combating. I think what we've found is that there's been a straw man used, which in other words is to say that organizations like AfriForum believe that there is a white genocide, there is no such thing, therefore they're a laughable organization. Now, AfriForum have made it very clear on a number of occasions that they don't believe in a white genocide either. But they do think that there is race-based attacks, that there is boiling racial tension, and that's something worth monitoring.
Right.
So I think that's the first thing. Secession's pretty interesting. So most people, when they talk about secession in South Africa, they talk about Cape secession, and they talk about kind of the old Cape province. So they want the Western Cape plus the Northern Cape. And I've got a couple of thoughts on it. The one is just purely practical, which is the size of something like that, and the idea of being your own state and what it would mean to declare your own state, which it's very unlikely that the South African government would be happy with you saying, well, we're not part of the South African government anymore. We're our own thing. We're now, the country of the Cape. You would likely have a big war, and you'd have a very big border, border to fight over.
Right.
Here's the other thing, which is there's a really nice map of tax contributions in the country by province. Now, the Western Cape contributes about 15% of the taxes to the country, and the Northern Cape, I think it's about 1.3%. Gauteng, on the other hand, is 49%. So if you wanted a country out of South Africa to carve out, I would think that country would be something like Gauteng, which is about the size of Lesotho or of Swaziland, which are independent states, and which is a very financially prosperous place, which is currently, let's say, spending a lot of its tax revenues going to to the national fiscus and is being spent in other provinces. So if there were to be a declaration of succession, that would be the sort of more rational spot. Now, I don't know if there's much appetite for Gauteng secession. So, yeah, I think what is interesting at the moment, what we are seeing with COVID, is this complete rise in nationalism. So if you think about the debate we've had over the last couple of years about free movement of people and about the EU and about Brexit,
right,
that conversation has been completely superseded by events. Germany, which has sort of been spearheading the idea of a European family, really, of people being able to move between different countries, closed its borders. In South Africa, we haven't just closed our national borders, we've closed our provincial borders. You can't move from one province to another unless you have a very, very good reason to do so. It's tightly regulated. So what we might find in the post-COVID world is a retreat to these kinds of sub-nations. I mean, to communities, to suburbs,
right,
and a greater level of self-reliance. So I've always thought that for South Africa to have its own manufacturing capacity was kind of silly because, well, the Chinese are going to do it better and cheaper, and their labor costs are lower than ours, and we'll always be able to freely trade with each other. We're now finding those assumptions being tested because supply lines are going to be, we've closed a bunch of our ports. It's not clear that we're going to be able to rely on all these goods from the rest of the world, and we might need some sort of localized production capacity for certain services, and you might find that happening all around the world. So that kind of localization, I think, is going to happen more and more. And so maybe, you will find more secessionist groups happening at the moment because, practically all they can rely on are those within their immediate surrounds as opposed to the supranation.
right. Now, in closing this live stream, I have a special announcement to make, guys. This very rarely happens, but one of our very earliest subscribers to the Loving Life channel was Jaco van der Merwe, and he has been a rock when it comes to live streams, and we have less than 10 heroes on this channel. A couple of them are here on the live stream at the moment, and I just want to welcome Jaco van der Merwe as a hero in the Loving Life channel. Congratulations, Jaco. Welcome to that very elite little group. Okay, now, Mark, once again, thank you so much for your involvement and discussion tonight. It's really appreciated. I think what AfriForum is doing is fantastic. I mean, they're really a voice out there, and they're giving great advice, and it's people like you within the organization that really make a difference, and you being available to talk to people like this is very, very important because it's really getting the message out there. And thank you so much for being with us tonight.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And for our moderators, and congrats, Jaco, once again. Thank you guys for keeping the side chat under control. I know there are times when it gets a bit nasty out there, but you always do a great job. And to all those who've watched tonight, thank you so much for being part of the live stream that we've had. And don't forget, tomorrow night we have another live stream, and that's going to be quite fascinating. We're going to be talking about a whole range of issues. I've actually put out the alert, so just go and have a look at the alert to find out what that's all about. Alright guys, please take care. I'm just about to log off, and in closing, once again, thank you, Mark, and take care, and to everybody else watching, please take care, and good night.